Imagine stepping into a room where time itself has turned to stone, yet the ghosts of human habit still haunt the heavy, salt-soaked air. This was the bone-chilling reality that greeted the crew of the Dei Grazia as they crossed onto the deck of that drifting phantom vessel, the Mary Celeste. If you are listening to my stories right now, I wonder, where in the world are you joining me from? Perhaps wrapped in the silence of the night, or stealing a moment amid the noise of the day. Wherever you are welcome here. But before we descend further into the shadows of this riddle, if you are a soul drawn to the whispered secrets of the past and the mysteries history chose to bury, then you have found your sanctuary. Join our growing circle of seekers by subscribing to Dreamy Old Stories. Together, let us venture into the darkest corridors of history, where truth hides just beyond the lantern's reach, and every story guards a secret. Welcome back. This is Dreamy Old Stories, and today, we uncover a tale that was never meant to be told. Inside the forsaken cabins of the Mary Celeste, ordinary possessions lay scattered in quiet stillness throughout the drifting brigantine, as though daily life had been suspended between one breath and the next. Damp charts rested upon the captain's table beneath navigation instruments dulled slightly by salt air and the relentless moisture of an Atlantic crossing. A sewing kit lay open near folded fabric where needles, thread, and small scissors remained arranged with deliberate care beside the cabin wall. Cups stood half-filled near the galley table, while a pipe rested untouched beside loose papers and personal belongings shifting softly with the restless motion of the sea. Near one sleeping bunk, a child's small shoe and a worn doll remained tucked beside blankets that still held the faint impression of a human form. The sensory atmosphere surrounding these objects carried an unsettling intimacy, for the belongings preserved the traces of ordinary human routine with far greater clarity than any written testimony could offer. The cabins breathed faintly of seawater, lamp oil, damp wool, and old tea leaves absorbed deep into wooden walls during long, monotonous days at sea. Moisture gathered along the curling edges of paper charts, while lantern light from the boarding crew fell softly upon brass instruments and metal utensils abandoned after an unfinished meal. Each object responded gently to the brigantine's restless movement. Cups trembled faintly against the table's surface. Loose pages stirred whenever colder Atlantic air crept through cracks near the windows. Somewhere beyond the cabins, waves continued their hollow percussion against the hull, a slow, indifferent rhythm beneath the drifting ship, carrying these silent possessions onward through a gray and indifferent winter sea. As the sailors from the Dei Grazia examined the abandoned brigantine with growing unease, the smallest details began to demand attention. One man noticed a razor and shaving soap positioned neatly beside a wash basin, as though prepared for a morning ritual that had been interrupted before it began. Another lifted damp clothing from a storage chest where garments lay folded with domestic tenderness rather than the urgency of emergency departure. Navigation tools rested near unfinished calculations pinned beside compass readings and weather observations across the captain's desk. In the galley, utensils and dishes still waited patiently near crumbs scattered across the worn wooden table surface. These objects offered no dramatic evidence of struggle or catastrophe. Instead, they spoke of small, interrupted actions, ordinary tasks left half done by people who had every reason to believe they would return within moments, rather than vanish forever from the only world surrounding them. For those studying the belongings aboard the Mary Celeste, the emotional weight came from the quiet humanity preserved within such unremarkable objects. A ship may be built for cargo, sails, and instruments, yet personal possessions reveal the softer, more fragile texture of daily existence hidden beneath maritime labor and Atlantic weather. The sewing tools suggested patience and domestic habit during long evenings at sea. The child's belongings carried traces of play and comfort within the narrow confines of the cabin walls. Half-filled cups implied conversation interrupted before its natural end. Even the damp charts reflected careful responsibility and the steady attention of a man navigating treacherous waters. Together, these scattered possessions assembled a silent portrait of human presence, intimate and deeply ordinary, without offering a single answer for what had erased it. Around the drifting brigantine, the Atlantic continued its slow rolling beneath pale winter light, while unanswered absence settled like fog among the abandoned belongings. The captain's cabin drew particular scrutiny from the boarding crew, for so many personal and professional objects remained arranged in recognizable order despite the total absence of those who had once lived among them. Navigation charts covered sections of the desk beneath brass instruments dulled slightly by moisture drawn through the Atlantic air. A compass rested beside an open logbook where recent entries ended abruptly in careful, unhurried handwriting, the script of a man absorbed in routine, not gripped by terror. Nearby shelves held books pressed firmly together against the shifting of rough weather. Folded garments remained stored inside narrow compartments beside small private objects carried aboard for comfort during the long crossing. Even the arrangement of furniture reflected a practical domestic life shaped by constant motion, unpredictable weather, and the confined geometry of a brigantine drifting silently through gray Atlantic water. The sensory atmosphere within the cabin carried subtle, persistent reminders of recent human presence that the sailors found difficult to dismiss. Damp paper released a faint, earthy smell as moisture settled into charts and written pages left exposed near the desk. The air held traces of candle wax, seawater, wool fabric, and old tobacco smoke absorbed deep into timber walls polished by years of maritime passage. When the brigantine rolled against larger swells, loose objects tapped gently against one another inside drawers and shelves, while lantern light shifted slowly across the room in trembling arcs. One sailor opened a cabinet and discovered preserved food supplies stacked carefully beside cups and utensils still set for ordinary use. Another brushed water droplets from the captain's instruments before returning them to the table where they had rested, untouched, since the moment the brigantine lost its people. As the boarding party continued moving through the scattered objects of the cabins, they noticed signs of routines disrupted gradually rather than violently. A pen remained beside unfinished notes written in dark, fading ink. A pair of spectacles rested folded near the edge of the table as though set aside after an unhurried moment of reading. Blankets lay partly disturbed across one bunk, while nearby clothing suggested movement between ordinary tasks rather than any deliberate preparation for departure. The sailors moved carefully through these spaces, lifting belongings gently and returning them precisely where they had been found. Each object invited speculation, yet confirmed nothing. Some imagined sudden weather driving Captain Briggs and his crew briefly into the missing lifeboat. Others considered illness, navigational dread, or unseen damage lurking below deck. Yet the quiet, undisturbed domestic order preserved throughout the brigantine resisted every straightforward explanation proposed aboard the drifting vessel. For the men moving through the Mary Celeste, the emotional experience deepened through repeated encounters with these abandoned personal details. Large mysteries most often reveal themselves through small, ordinary evidence rather than through dramatic, visible destruction. The untouched spectacles, the folded clothing, and the unfinished handwriting spoke of calm, familiar moments interrupted without the slightest warning. Human beings leave emotional impressions within private objects because habitual routine reflects comfort, trust, and quiet confidence in the future. Those aboard the brigantine had arranged their possessions as any person does when they believe another morning will arrive much like the one before. The Atlantic surrounding the vessel offered no explanation for why those expectations had been so completely erased. Beyond the cabin windows, cold gray waves continued rising and falling beneath drifting winter cloud, while silent possessions waited inside empty wooden rooms for owners who would never return. Elsewhere aboard the Mary Celeste, smaller possessions scattered through passageways and sleeping quarters quietly deepened the impression of interrupted life preserved within the drifting brigantine. Near one bunk, a pair of worn boots rested carefully beside folded blankets darkened slightly by damp Atlantic air. A comb lay beside the wash basin with several strands of hair still caught between its teeth. In another section of the cabin, sewing threads stretched loosely across unfinished fabric where careful, patient work had been abandoned midway through completion. Cups and bottles shifted gently upon shelves each time the brigantine rolled across uneven swells beneath the gray and featureless sky. None of these objects appeared remarkable when viewed in isolation. Together, they assembled a detailed portrait of ordinary existence continuing naturally aboard the ship, until silence descended and swallowed every familiar routine whole. The sensory experience surrounding these belongings deepened the strange, oppressive atmosphere felt by the boarding crew. Damp wood carried the layered smell of seawater, old fabric, soap, tobacco, and spoiled food lingering within the narrow passageways. When sailors opened storage compartments, colder Atlantic air moved slowly through the cabins and disturbed loose pages resting beside lanterns and navigation tools. Water tapped faintly within the hull below deck, while the brigantine responded unceasingly to the motion of the sea surrounding it. A spoon rattled gently inside a cupboard during stronger swells. Hanging coats brushed against wooden walls with soft, repetitive scraping. Somewhere overhead, wind passed through loose rigging and drifting sails with a low, mournful sound that seemed to belong to no living throat. The ship remained physically alive with movement and sound, even as every human presence once connected to those belongings had dissolved into the Atlantic distance. As the day wore on, sailors from the Dei Grazia noted additional details suggesting that ordinary routines had been interrupted during the brigantine's final occupied hours. A prayer book rested near the bed beside folded reading glasses and candle stubs burned unevenly from previous nights at sea. Children's belongings appeared in small, unexpected places throughout the cabin, a ribbon tucked inside a drawer, a doll leaning against the wall beside a chest of clothing. Crumbs remained scattered across the galley table where a meal appeared to have ended without any attempt at cleanup afterward. Even practical maritime tools reflected unfinished activity. A sounding rod used to measure water levels rested near the hatch, while sections of rope appeared recently handled before being abandoned where they fell. The boarding crew moved through these discoveries slowly, their voices dropping to quieter tones as the weight of uncertainty settled more heavily around the drifting ship. For those encountering the Mary Celeste during those cold Atlantic days, the abandoned objects carried emotional force precisely because they revealed the invisible contours of missing lives more clearly than any written account could provide. Personal belongings preserve human rhythm through familiar arrangement and repeated, unconscious use. A folded blanket suggests rest. Sewing tools imply long, patient evenings by lantern light. A half-completed meal reflects conversation and domestic habit unfolding within the wooden walls of a ship at sea. The brigantine contained evidence of people moving through ordinary days, utterly unaware they were preparing for disappearance. Yet the Atlantic had erased the final moment connecting those quiet possessions to the hands that had touched them. Beyond the empty cabins, gray waves rolled endlessly beneath drifting winter light, while forgotten objects continued their gentle, meaningless shifting across the silent, moving ship. As evening approached the Mary Celeste, the abandoned objects within the brigantine seemed transformed by the changing light filtering through damp cabin windows and swaying lanterns. Shadows stretched long across the captain's desk, where charts curled slightly from absorbed moisture carried endlessly through the Atlantic air. Brass instruments caught dim yellow lantern light in brief, trembling flashes whenever the ship rolled against larger swells. Along the sleeping quarters, blankets shifted faintly with the motion of the sea, while clothing hanging beside the walls brushed softly against timber darkened by age and salt. The galley table remained undisturbed beneath scattered crumbs and half-emptied cups whose contents had long since cooled into silence. Outside the cabins, ropes creaked steadily overhead, while gray Atlantic water struck the hull with slow, heavy rhythm beneath the drifting brigantine. The sensory atmosphere surrounding these belongings grew more dense and intimate during the evening hours. Lantern smoke drifted through narrow passageways and merged with the smell of damp paper, salt water, worn fabric, and old candle wax soaked deep into the ship's wooden interior. Sailors from the Dei Grazia moved carefully through the cabins carrying lights that illuminated only small portions of the brigantine at a time, leaving the rest in shifting, uncertain shadow. Their footsteps echoed softly against floorboards worn smooth by years of maritime routine. Every sound seemed unnaturally distinct within the abandoned vessel. A drawer sliding open, metal utensils tapping faintly together inside the galley, water shifting below deck beside the cargo hold. The ordinary sounds of shipboard life continued surrounding the boarding crew, yet every human response that should have followed those sounds remained absent from the drifting Atlantic ship. Throughout the evening, further observations quietly reshaped the sailors' understanding of the final hours aboard the brigantine. A journal page left unfinished near the captain's desk suggested interrupted concentration rather than panic or violence. Sarah Briggs's sewing materials remained arranged with domestic deliberateness beside folded fabric untouched since the ship's abandonment. Navigation calculations rested beside compass readings, and weather notes recorded in the days immediately before the disappearance claimed the vessel. Even the placement of cups and utensils implied ordinary conversation continuing naturally during meals before the sudden, unexplained departure from the brigantine. Some sailors returned to these details repeatedly, as though prolonged examination might finally unlock hidden meaning buried within the arrangement of objects. Yet every item seemed poised exactly between the familiar and the inexplicable, offering traces of daily life while concealing the final decision that had emptied the ship of its people. For the boarding party, the emotional toll of these belongings deepened through repetition rather than revelation. Human presence lingers within private objects through the quiet accumulation of habit, touch, and routine shaped across many days at sea. The spectacles resting beside the chart table spoke of careful study and professional responsibility. The child's ribbon whispered of innocence carried into the difficult, indifferent world of Atlantic travel. Half-finished sewing implied calm evening hours passed beneath lantern light while waves moved unseen beyond the hull. Together these belongings formed a silent emotional landscape far more unsettling than any scene of visible destruction might have been. The Mary Celeste preserved the ordinary texture of human life, while withholding the precise, final moment when those lives separated from the moving wooden world that had contained them. Beyond the drifting brigantine, the Atlantic darkened gradually beneath the advancing winter night. Night settled over the Mary Celeste until the abandoned belongings within the brigantine seemed suspended in drifting pools of lantern light and Atlantic darkness. The ship rolled softly across long winter swells while pale mist threaded silently through sections of rigging above the empty deck. Inside the cabins, objects once handled casually during ordinary moments now carried strange and heavy significance beneath the quiet surrounding them. Cups rested beside cold utensils upon the galley table, while loose papers stirred faintly whenever wind found its way through narrow cracks along the walls. A child's doll leaned sideways near the bunk where blankets remained folded against damp timber. Navigation instruments caught brief, trembling flashes of lantern glow before sinking once more into shadow as the brigantine continued its silent drift across dark Atlantic water beneath low cloud and indifferent stars. The sensory atmosphere inside the empty ship grew denser and more suffocating during the nighttime hours, for ordinary domestic traces remained preserved so completely within the wooden cabins. Damp wool coats released faint, earthy smells near the sleeping quarters while candle wax, salt water, tobacco smoke, and spoiled food lingered softly within the enclosed air. Lantern flames swayed unceasingly with the brigantine's motion, causing shadows to creep and retreat across sewing tools, folded clothing, scattered crumbs, and handwritten notes abandoned upon the captain's desk. Water tapped steadily against the hull below deck in hollow, rhythmic patterns that rose upward through the ship's bones. Occasionally a loose spoon rattled against a cup, or a hanging lantern chain brushed lightly against a ceiling beam. These small sounds granted the brigantine a deeply unsettling sense of incomplete life, continuing quietly, mechanically, without the people who once gave it meaning. As sailors from the Dei Grazia maintained their watch through the night, their attention returned again and again to the abandoned possessions scattered throughout the brigantine. Some examined the navigation papers carefully beneath lantern light, searching for overlooked clues concealed within compass readings, weather notations, or incomplete calculations. Others moved slowly through the cabins, opening drawers, storage chests, and shelves where private belongings remained arranged with familiar, unhurried domestic order. A prayer book rested near the bed beside reading glasses and folded garments untouched by panic or theft. The galley still bore the marks of interrupted routine through dishes left unwashed after an unfinished meal. Yet despite each new discovery, the essential mystery surrounding the Mary Celeste remained sealed and impenetrable. Every object preserved evidence of human presence, while concealing the final moment when those lives vanished from the drifting ship. For the men spending those long hours aboard the brigantine, the emotional atmosphere likely grew heavier through repetition and the particular silence of the open sea at night. Human beings comprehend absence most profoundly through familiar objects left behind when ordinary life has ended without warning or explanation. A cup implies recent conversation. Folded clothing suggests confident expectation of another morning. A child's belongings carry traces of protection and comfort within an indifferent and dangerous world. The Mary Celeste bore countless signs of people who had intended to continue living within its wooden walls through every remaining mile of the Atlantic crossing ahead. Instead, only their possessions remained, shifting gently with the sea beneath lantern light and winter sky. Beyond the rail of the brigantine, dark Atlantic waves rolled outward through mist and cold wind, while unanswered silence gathered thickly among the forgotten belongings of the abandoned ship. By the time the Mary Celeste continued onward under guidance from the De Grazia crew, the abandoned belongings aboard the brigantine had become something more than mere evidence of disappearance. They had become a quiet map of daily life preserved within the drifting wooden structure crossing the Atlantic. Every cabin carried signs of routine disrupted during ordinary moments rather than during any dramatic catastrophe. Damp charts remained spread across the captain's desk beside navigation instruments used with careful attention only days before. Sewing tools rested where patient hands had last arranged them beneath shifting lantern light. Cups, books, clothing, and personal objects continued their gentle movement with the sea, as though still participating in the familiar rhythms of shipboard existence. The brigantine traveled onward beneath pale winter skies, carrying these silent traces of human life through cold Atlantic water. The physical atmosphere surrounding the objects shifted gradually as weather and time continued working upon the abandoned ship. Moisture spread deeper into paper charts and softened the edges of handwritten notes left exposed within the cabins. Salt air settled heavily into blankets, coats, and stored fabric near the walls while lantern smoke darkened sections of ceiling above the sleeping quarters. During rougher swells, utensils tapped softly against one another inside drawers, and loose belongings shifted slightly across shelves worn smooth by years of maritime use. The smell of seawater, damp timber, old food, and candle wax remained sealed within the enclosed air of the brigantine, moving endlessly across the Atlantic. Even after its people had vanished, the ship itself continued responding to weather, tide, and motion just as it had during ordinary days filled with human voices and the sounds of labor. As the voyage toward port progressed, sailors aboard the De Grazia grew increasingly familiar with the arrangement of belongings left behind within the Mary Celeste. Certain objects drew repeated, almost involuntary attention because they seemed especially intimate or emotionally revealing. The child's doll resting near the bunk, the folded spectacles beside unfinished navigation notes, Sarah Briggs's sewing materials arranged carefully beside fabric still waiting for the hands that would never complete it. Some sailors likely avoided disturbing these possessions unnecessarily, sensing the quiet human stories preserved within them. Others examined practical maritime items more closely, searching for overlooked evidence that might finally explain why the brigantine had been abandoned despite remaining entirely seaworthy. Yet each new observation produced the same frustrating outcome. The objects clarified how the missing passengers had lived aboard the ship, while revealing almost nothing certain about how they had ceased to do so. For those who later reflected upon the mystery of the Mary Celeste, the forgotten belongings remained among the most haunting elements of the entire story. Ships are constructed from timber, rope, sailcloth, and iron, yet it is human presence that transforms them into lived spaces layered with memory, habit, and routine. The abandoned objects aboard the brigantine preserved that transformation long after the people themselves had ceased to exist within its walls. A half-filled cup implied interrupted conversation. Folded blankets suggested recent rest and quiet expectation. Navigation charts reflected careful responsibility and belief in a future that would continue unfolding. Together, these ordinary possessions carried emotional weight precisely because they had belonged to lives proceeding normally until some unknown, unreachable moment altered everything without leaving a single witness behind. Beyond the cabins and the drifting lantern light, the Atlantic rolled onward beneath winter clouds and pale distant stars, while the unanswered mystery traveled silently across history beside the forgotten objects of an empty ship. But as the drifting vessel was slowly towed toward harbor, the heavy silence of the open ocean gave way to a completely different storm. A tempest of human curiosity, dark rumors, and spreading legends. When the Mary Celeste finally reached shore beneath gray winter skies, the brigantine entered a world utterly unlike the cold, indifferent Atlantic waters where it had been discovered drifting alone. Harbor docks filled rapidly with curious workers, sailors, merchants, and reporters pressing close to the weather-stained vessel resting beside the pier. The ship itself appeared deceptively ordinary from a distance. Its mast still rose above the harbor, and its hull bore only the familiar marks of rough weather and long sea passage. Yet people stared toward the silent brigantine with unusual, almost fearful attention as barrels were unloaded and officials moved between cabins carrying notebooks, lanterns, and damp navigation papers recovered from the abandoned ship. The atmosphere surrounding the docks carried a restless mixture of smoke, seawater, wet timber, and human conversation spreading through crowded waterfront streets. Newspaper men hurried between taverns and shipping offices searching for details that might forge uncertainty into dramatic story. Sailors leaned across wooden counters speaking in lowered voices about the untouched meal, the missing lifeboat, and the family belongings discovered aboard the drifting brigantine. Coal smoke drifted low above the harbor, while rainwater pooled in the uneven stones beside warehouse doors and crowded alleyways. Inside dim taverns warmed by lantern light and heavy coats steaming near the fire, voices blended with the clatter of cups striking tables and distant harbor bells echoing through the damp evening air. Rumors moved quickly through such places where maritime stories traveled far faster than verified truth. As days passed, the story surrounding the Mary Celeste began changing shape through repetition, exaggeration, and speculation carried from one conversation into the next. Some newspapers described mutiny among the crew, while others suggested piracy somewhere along the Atlantic shipping routes. Certain writers seized upon the cargo of industrial alcohol stored below deck and conjured invisible explosions terrifying enough to drive Captain Briggs into abandoning the vessel entirely. Dock workers repeated stranger theories involving giant waves, sea creatures, or mysterious weather capable of swallowing entire families without leaving a single visible trace. With each retelling, ordinary details aboard the brigantine shifted slightly further from fact toward legend. The half-filled cups, damp charts, and abandoned sewing tools became symbols that people arranged into stories shaped by personal fear, imagination, and fascination with forces hidden beyond the ordinary sea. For many who first heard about the Mary Celeste during those early months, the mystery carried emotional force because it touched anxieties already woven deeply into maritime life. The Atlantic had long represented both possibility and peril for those living beside its restless shores. Ships disappeared occasionally without explanation. Storms erased lives quietly beyond the horizon where no witness remained to describe final moments. The abandoned brigantine seemed to embody those fears in unusually intimate form because so many signs of ordinary human life remained preserved aboard the empty vessel. Newspapers transformed that silence into entertainment and speculation. Yet beneath the dramatic headlines lingered something far quieter and more human. A family had vanished. A ship had drifted alone across cold water. And somewhere beyond all the rumors, the Atlantic kept its final answer buried beneath mist, distance, and endless gray sea. As the Mary Celeste remained docked along the harbor, crowds continued gathering near the brigantine each day with quiet fascination shaped by rumor and mounting uncertainty. Men in heavy wool coats paused beside the pier to stare toward the weathered hull, while children climbed crates and barrels searching for glimpses of the mysterious ship discussed throughout the waterfront districts. Reporters moved repeatedly between newspaper offices, shipping companies, and taverns carrying fragments of testimony gathered from sailors who had stepped aboard the abandoned vessel at sea. The brigantine itself rested silently beside the dock amid the ordinary noise of harbor life. Nearby ships loaded cargo, ferries crossed gray winter water, and dock workers continued their labor beneath drifting smoke and cold rain. Yet the Mary Celeste drew attention unlike any ordinary merchant vessel because absence itself had become its most visible and unsettling cargo. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the growing rumors carried the particular texture of crowded maritime towns during the 19th century. Wet streets reeked of horse sweat, coal smoke, seawater, and damp newspaper ink freshly pressed onto broad printed pages announcing new theories about the abandoned brigantine. Tavern rooms filled with the warmth of lantern light, pipe smoke, spilled ale, and rough voices exchanging dark speculation late into the evening. Sailors returning from Atlantic voyages listened carefully while storms rattled shutters and winter wind moved through narrow harbor alleys outside. In quieter corners near the docks, older mariners spoke more softly about strange weather, sudden terror at sea, and the unsettling silence reportedly found within the cabins of the drifting ship. The story surrounding the Mary Celeste spread not through formal investigation alone, but through atmosphere itself, carried across crowded waterfront life by the oldest medium known to sailors, whispered conversation after nightfall. As newspaper articles multiplied, the mystery gradually detached itself from the smaller practical realities of maritime life. Writers searching for dramatic headlines expanded uncertain evidence into vivid imagined scenes aboard the brigantine before its abandonment. One article described mutiny and violence among drunken sailors maddened by fumes rising from the valuable alcohol cargo below deck. Another insisted that explosions invisible to the eye had thrown Captain Briggs into ordering immediate evacuation of the vessel. Certain stories wandered still further from plausible explanation, speaking of sea creatures surfacing from impossible depths, unnatural fogs rolling in from nowhere, or ghostly apparitions crossing the Atlantic beside abandoned ships. With each new publication, the Mary Celeste transformed slightly within public imagination. The drifting brigantine became less a damaged merchant vessel discovered at sea and more a floating symbol onto which people projected fear, wonder, and fascination with forces lurking beyond ordinary understanding. For the people hearing these stories in crowded cities far from the Atlantic crossing itself, the mystery likely offered emotional escape from daily routine as much as genuine concern for truth. Human beings respond to uncertainty by building narratives large enough to contain it. The untouched meal aboard the brigantine invited imagination because it suggested interruption without visible cause. The abandoned belongings carried an intimacy missing from maritime disasters where ships vanished entirely without trace. Through rumor and retelling, listeners could place themselves briefly inside those empty cabins lit by swaying lanterns and surrounded by cold Atlantic darkness. Yet beneath all the speculation remained the quieter reality preserved within the drifting brigantine itself. Real people had occupied those cabins. Real voices had once filled those passageways. The Atlantic alone had witnessed the final moment separating the Mary Celeste from the lives once carried aboard its wooden decks. In the weeks following the brigantine's arrival at port, the story of the Mary Celeste traveled far beyond the harbor where the abandoned ship had first drawn crowds. Newspapers carried reports across Atlantic cities and smaller coastal towns where readers unfolded damp printed pages beside breakfast tables, railway stations, and crowded cafes warmed against the winter cold. Illustrations began appearing beside articles, depicting imagined scenes of frightened sailors abandoning ship beneath violent seas or shadowy figures moving through fog around the drifting brigantine. The real vessel remained tied quietly beside the docks while public imagination expanded outward far beyond the physical details actually discovered aboard. Ordinary maritime objects, the damp charts, the unfinished meal, the child's belongings, slowly transformed into symbolic fragments repeated endlessly through public retelling. The sensory world surrounding these spreading stories differed enormously from the silent Atlantic atmosphere where the mystery had first taken shape. Printing presses thundered through the night, producing fresh editions filled with breathless speculation about the abandoned ship. Newspaper ink stained fingers and sleeves as vendors shouted headlines through rain-soaked streets crowded with wagons and pedestrians. In waterfront taverns, sailors listened while glasses struck wooden counters and pipe smoke drifted beneath dim lanterns hanging from darkened ceiling beams. The smell of coal fires mixed with wet wool clothing carried indoors after long hours beside cold harbor wind. Even people who had never laid eyes upon the Atlantic crossing could almost picture the creaking brigantine through these layered descriptions repeated across newspapers, conversations, and exaggerated maritime stories spreading steadily from one port town to another. As public fascination deepened, new explanations surfaced constantly from journalists, dockworkers, amateur investigators, and storytellers eager to attach meaning to the unanswered disappearance. Certain reports described mutiny among desperate sailors driven to madness by isolation and alcohol fumes rising from damaged cargo barrels below deck. Others insisted that violent storms or waterspouts had forced the crew temporarily into the missing lifeboat before separation from the brigantine became permanent and irreversible. Some writers introduced darker possibilities involving murder, piracy, or supernatural intervention concealed within Atlantic fog. Each theory reshaped the story slightly further from the quiet, practical reality preserved aboard the drifting ship. The Mary Celeste became increasingly impossible to separate from the mythology surrounding it, because repetition itself slowly altered how people remembered the abandoned brigantine and the vanished lives once carried within its cabins. For many observers living far from maritime life, the mystery of the Mary Celeste likely resonated because it reflected a deeper uncertainty about the ocean during the 19th century. The Atlantic connected continents through trade and travel, yet vast stretches of open water remained physically unknowable to most people reading about the drifting brigantine from distant inland cities. The sea represented movement, opportunity, weather, disappearance, and death simultaneously. Through rumor and speculation, people attempted to give emotional shape to forces too vast and remote for direct understanding. Yet beneath every dramatic newspaper theory lingered the quieter truth preserved within the abandoned ship itself. A family cabin left orderly beneath lantern light, personal belongings untouched by theft or violence. The silent evidence of ordinary life interrupted somewhere beyond sight of land, while the Atlantic rolled endlessly beneath gray winter sky. As months passed, the Mary Celeste gradually shifted from recent maritime event into something closer to shared legend carried between ports across long ocean routes. The brigantine itself aged quietly beside changing docks and weathered piers while stories about the abandoned ship continued expanding through repetition and distance. Sailors arriving from Atlantic crossings heard different versions of the mystery, depending upon which harbor they entered and which taverns they visited after nightfall. Some accounts described violence aboard the brigantine before the disappearance. Others insisted the ship had been found drifting beneath a strange, unmoving fog. In newspaper illustrations, the vessel often appeared darker and more damaged than reality, floating beneath storm clouds or unnatural skies that reflected public imagination rather than the pale winter Atlantic where it had truly drifted alone. The sensory atmosphere surrounding these retellings belonged entirely to crowded 19th century harbor life, shaped by weather, labor, and long Atlantic crossings. Winter rain darkened cobblestone streets outside taverns where sailors gathered beside smoky lanterns and warm fires after months away at sea. Damp coats steamed gently near the walls while tankards struck rough wooden tables during animated conversation about storms, strange lights, and ships discovered drifting without crew or explanation. Newspapers carrying fresh speculation about the Mary Celeste passed between roughened hands still marked by rope work and salt water. Printing ink mixed with the smell of tobacco, seawater, ale, and wet wool filling crowded rooms where maritime rumor moved more quickly than official investigation ever could. Even those who doubted the stranger theories often listened carefully because the Atlantic itself had long taught sailors how easily certainty could dissolve beyond the horizon. Gradually, the details repeated most persistently about the brigantine became those carrying the strongest emotional or imaginative power rather than those most firmly anchored in evidence. The abandoned meal appeared in nearly every version of the story, even when other facts shifted or disappeared. Writers described cups still warm beside untouched plates, though such details could never truthfully be confirmed. The child's belongings attracted particular attention because they deepened the emotional weight of the disappearance with a cruelty that no invented detail could match. Rumors evolved naturally through retelling. A damaged rope became proof of desperate escape. Damp charts transformed into evidence of navigational confusion and hidden panic. Even practical explanations involving alcohol fumes or rough weather slowly blended with tales of ghosts, sea monsters, and invisible forces waiting beyond the edges of ordinary understanding. The Mary Celeste drifted further into myth each time its story crossed another harbor or appeared beneath another dramatic newspaper headline. For people living far from the sea, the emotional power of the legend likely came from how quietly it unsettled ordinary assumptions about safety, routine, and human presence. The brigantine had not vanished entirely into a storm like so many lost ships before it. Instead, it remained physically present while its people disappeared without clear explanation. That difference transformed the Mary Celeste into something hauntingly intimate. Empty cabins suggested interrupted conversations and unfinished routines rather than distant catastrophe buried beneath the waves. A child's belongings resting quietly within the abandoned vessel made the absence feel personal rather than abstract. Long after newspaper excitement faded, the Atlantic continued carrying the deeper emotional meaning of the story through memory and imagination. Somewhere beyond all the rumors and dramatic retellings lingered the quieter image of a drifting brigantine moving silently beneath pale winter sky and endless gray sea. By the later years of the 19th century, the story of the Mary Celeste had settled deep into maritime culture where fact, memory, and invention often moved together like fog across open water. Sailors continued mentioning the brigantine during long Atlantic crossings while younger crewmen listened beside lantern light and the rolling of restless seas. The abandoned ship appeared regularly in newspapers, serialized stories, and public lectures where each retelling introduced small changes shaped by the demands of entertainment far more than accuracy. Some descriptions imagined violent storms tearing across the deck before the crew vanished. Others placed eerie silence over calm water beneath moonlight and drifting mist. Meanwhile, the real brigantine remained far simpler in physical form. A weathered merchant vessel carrying ordinary cargo through ordinary Atlantic conditions before becoming permanently bound to unanswered absence. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the legend expanded far beyond the original discovery at sea. Harbor taverns echoed with repeated versions of the story beneath tobacco smoke and dim lantern glow, while rain and seawater gathered outside along crowded docks. In quieter homes far from the Atlantic coast, readers unfolded newspaper pages beside evening fires and tried to picture the abandoned cabins described within the articles. Printing presses rattled through the night, producing dramatic headlines, while illustrations transformed the brigantine into a darker and more ghostly image than those who had actually boarded the vessel ever encountered. Across oceans and cities, the Mary Celeste entered human imagination through layered sensory worlds shaped by ink, smoke, conversation, weather, and the timeless emotional pull of maritime mystery carried through generations of storytelling. As decades accumulated, new theories continued attaching themselves to the brigantine whenever writers revisited the old disappearance. Some explanations focused upon practical maritime dangers such as alcohol fumes, navigational miscalculation, rough weather, or fear triggered by temporary flooding discovered below deck. Others drifted steadily toward the supernatural, describing curses, sea creatures, invisible forces, or ghostly intervention concealed somewhere beyond the horizon. The abandoned belongings aboard the brigantine remained central within nearly every version because they preserved a feeling of interrupted normality that proved extraordinarily difficult to forget. The half-filled cups, the folded clothing, the damp charts spread across the captain's desk. These objects survived repeated retelling because they anchored the larger mystery within recognizable human routine. Even when facts blurred beneath exaggeration, the ordinary details aboard the ship continued giving emotional shape to the unanswered disappearance. For many people, the lasting power of the Mary Celeste never truly depended upon solving the mystery itself. The story endured because it touched something quieter and more permanent within human imagination. Something about absence, isolation, and the fragile routines people build against uncertainty. A drifting ship filled with personal belongings, yet emptied of every living soul, suggested how suddenly ordinary existence might separate from all explanation. The Atlantic became more than physical setting within that emotional landscape. It represented distance, silence, weather, memory, and the unknowable spaces beyond human control. Long after newspapers stopped printing dramatic headlines about the brigantine, the image survived within maritime culture. Somewhere in collective memory, the Mary Celeste still drifts slowly beneath pale winter clouds while lantern light trembles softly inside abandoned cabins and gray Atlantic waves roll endlessly beneath the empty, silent, unanswering wooden hull. When rumors fail to solve a tragedy, human law steps in. The shifting stories told in dockside taverns were soon forced into the cold, clinical reality of official courtrooms and administrative scrutiny. Inside government offices and maritime courtrooms near the harbor, the mystery of the Mary Celeste slowly transformed from rumor into official investigation. Heavy wooden desks filled the rooms beside tall windows clouded by winter rain and coal smoke drifting through the city streets outside. Damp navigation charts, shipping records, weather reports, and witness statements spread across tables beneath flickering lamps that burned late into the evening. Officials examined damaged logbooks recovered from the brigantine, while clerks copied testimony into thick ledgers already crowded with maritime cases from previous years. The abandoned ship itself rested nearby along the docks, weather-stained and silent beneath gray skies, while inside these offices men attempted to compress uncertainty into ordered explanation through documents, measurements, and legal procedure. The atmosphere surrounding the investigation carried the slow, suffocating heaviness of long administrative work shaped by paper, weather, and suspicion. Rooms breathed of candle wax, damp wool coats, ink, seawater tracked indoors upon sailors' boots, and old wooden furniture polished by years of official use. Pens scratched steadily across documents while rain tapped against window glass overlooking crowded harbor streets below. Sailors summoned to testify spoke quietly about the drifting brigantine, the untouched belongings, and the silent cabins discovered in the middle of the Atlantic. Outside the hearing rooms, newspaper reporters waited impatiently in narrow hallways warmed by coal stoves and thick human breath drifting through stale winter air. The mystery itself seemed to press down across these spaces, carried not through dramatic revelation, but through the endless repetition of uncertain details that refused to arrange themselves neatly into one complete story. As hearings continued over many weeks, investigators shifted repeatedly between competing theories while searching for evidence capable of settling suspicion permanently. Some officials examined the cargo of industrial alcohol and imagined invisible explosions that had terrified Captain Briggs into abandoning the ship temporarily at sea. Others focused upon damaged equipment, weather conditions, and missing navigation records recovered from the brigantine. Certain investigators questioned the crew of the Dei Grazia with growing suspicion, wondering whether salvage money or concealed violence connected somehow to the abandoned vessel drifting across the Atlantic. Witnesses returned repeatedly to the same fragments of evidence: damp charts, water within the hull, the missing lifeboat, untouched valuables. Yet each explanation crumbled once measured against the ordinary domestic details still preserved aboard the Mary Celeste when it reached shore. For those involved in the investigation, the emotional experience likely became exhausting through repetition and unresolved uncertainty rather than dramatic confrontation. Courts and officials depended upon evidence capable of producing conclusion. Yet the brigantine resisted every attempt to force its disappearance into clear legal understanding. The abandoned ship carried too many ordinary signs of calm routine beside too many unanswered absences. Human beings expect mysteries to narrow gradually towards certainty when examined carefully enough. The Mary Celeste instead seemed to expand beneath investigation, generating more speculation each time officials revisited the scattered belongings, damaged logs, and weather records connected to the voyage. Beyond the crowded hearing rooms and stacks of maritime documents, the Atlantic itself remained silent, holding whatever final truth had vanished somewhere beyond sight of land beneath cold winter sky and endless gray water. Day after day, the investigation surrounding the Mary Celeste unfolded through long sessions inside crowded maritime offices where officials attempted to reconstruct events that no living witness could fully describe. Tables filled gradually with weather maps, damaged papers recovered from the brigantine, testimony from sailors, and calculations regarding distance, tides, and possible movement across the Atlantic. Officials leaned over charts tracing routes with ink-stained fingers while clerks copied statements into thick-bound ledgers arranged carefully beside stacks of shipping documents. Outside the courthouse windows, harbor fog drifted slowly through narrow streets crowded with wagons, laborers, and newspaper vendors still repeating rumors about the abandoned ship. The brigantine itself remained nearby at dock, quiet and weather-worn beneath winter rain, while strangers continued searching its silent cabins for overlooked explanation. The sensory atmosphere inside the hearing rooms carried a weary mixture of concentration, suspicion, and maritime fatigue. Damp wool coats hung near doors beside umbrellas, dripping rainwater onto dark wooden floors polished smooth by years of legal routine. Candles and oil lamps filled the air with faint smoke, while ink dried slowly upon pages handled repeatedly by investigators examining the same uncertain details day after day. Sailors called to testify often carried traces of Atlantic travel directly into the courtroom. Salt had stiffened their coats. Their boots carried the faint smell of seawater and wet timber. Voices remained low and restrained beneath echoing ceilings as questions repeated endlessly about the untouched cargo, the missing lifeboat, and the abandoned belongings left scattered throughout the brigantine. Even silence inside the room felt heavy because everyone present understood how little certainty truly existed beneath the growing pile of official documents. As the hearings progressed, suspicion shifted repeatedly between practical maritime explanation and darker human possibility. Certain officials became convinced that hidden violence connected somehow to the crew of the Dei Grazia, who discovered the drifting vessel. Others focused instead upon natural causes such as storm damage, navigational fear, or temporary panic caused by alcohol fumes rising from the cargo hold. Witnesses described water found below deck, damaged equipment, and irregularities within the ship's records, while investigators compared each statement carefully against weather reports and surviving navigation notes. Yet every theory weakened under closer examination. The cargo remained largely untouched. Valuables had not been stolen. No visible evidence of struggle appeared within the cabins. The brigantine preserved traces of interrupted routine rather than obvious disaster, and that quiet contradiction frustrated every attempt to settle the mystery through ordinary legal reasoning. For many involved in the investigation, the emotional atmosphere likely shifted gradually from curiosity toward quiet exhaustion. Human institutions rely upon order, sequence, and conclusion to transform uncertainty into understandable narrative. The Mary Celeste resisted that process through absence itself. Officials could examine charts, question sailors, and calculate weather patterns across the Atlantic. Yet the essential moment remained hidden beyond reach. Somewhere between ordinary shipboard routine and the drifting abandonment discovered at sea, the final human explanation had vanished completely. Repeated hearings only deepened awareness of that missing space within the story. Beyond the courthouse walls, harbor bells continued sounding through winter mist while Atlantic tides moved patiently against the docks, carrying ships outward toward the same gray ocean that had preserved the mystery and refused to yield its final answer. As the investigation stretched onward through the winter months, the physical evidence connected to the Mary Celeste began showing signs of repeated handling and prolonged examination. Damp navigation charts curled further at the edges from constant exposure to cold office air and lantern heat. Logbooks passed through many hands while officials compared faded entries against weather reports gathered from other ships crossing the Atlantic during the same period. Brass instruments recovered from the brigantine rested upon tables beside rulers, ink bottles, and magnifying lenses used to inspect damaged markings or irregular notes. Outside the hearing rooms, rain darkened the harbor streets where the abandoned vessel remained tied quietly beside the docks. Its weather-stained hull rose and settled gently with the tide, while investigators continued searching through documents for clarity that the silent brigantine itself refused to provide. The sensory atmosphere surrounding these investigations carried the fatigue of prolonged uncertainty rather than dramatic revelation. Maritime offices smelled heavily of damp paper, candle smoke, seawater tracked indoors upon boots, and coal heat drifting from iron stoves placed near narrow windows fogged by winter condensation. Clerks copied testimony slowly into thick ledgers while officials turned pages already softened by moisture and repeated examination. The scratch of pens against paper blended with distant harbor sounds entering faintly through the walls. Ship bells, wagon wheels crossing wet stone streets, wind moving between crowded buildings beside the docks. Sailors waiting to testify sat quietly upon wooden benches, their coats carrying the smell of salt air and tobacco after long voyages at sea. The mystery itself seemed to settle physically into the atmosphere of these rooms through endless repetition of evidence that never fully connected into certainty. During this stage of the inquiry, investigators devoted increasing attention to weather records and navigational calculations in hopes that natural explanation might finally emerge from careful study. Officials examined reports of Atlantic storms, rough swells, shifting winds, and possible waterspouts occurring near the brigantine's route during the missing days before its discovery. Distances between recorded positions were measured repeatedly against the damaged logbook entries left aboard the Mary Celeste. Some theorized that Captain Briggs had feared the vessel was sinking after discovering water below deck and temporarily abandoned ship in the missing lifeboat, while expecting to remain connected by rope. Others argued that so experienced a mariner would never willingly surrender a seaworthy vessel under any such conditions. Every theory depended upon assumptions filling gaps left empty by missing records and vanished witnesses. The investigation moved constantly between possibility and doubt without resting securely upon either. For those participating in these hearings month after month, the emotional burden likely came from confronting how incomplete human understanding can remain despite careful effort and official authority. Courts and investigations often promise resolution through patience, evidence, and rational examination. Yet the Mary Celeste revealed limits hidden within those systems whenever crucial moments disappear beyond all observation. Officials could reconstruct routes across the Atlantic, question sailors about damaged rigging, and analyze weather patterns from distant ships, but none of those efforts restored the final human experience aboard the brigantine itself. The abandoned vessel preserved objects, routines, and fragments of daily life, while withholding the emotional reality of whatever fear, confusion, or decision separated its passengers from the ship. Beyond the harbor windows, winter rain continued falling across the city while the Atlantic carried its unanswered silence far beyond the reach of legal inquiry. As the hearings continued into later months, the investigation surrounding the Mary Celeste developed its own repetitive rhythm shaped by testimony, paperwork, and unresolved suspicion. Officials returned again and again to the same collection of evidence spread across crowded desks beneath dim office lamps. Damp charts recovered from the brigantine remained pinned beside weather reports, and handwritten witness statements copied carefully into thick maritime ledgers. The abandoned vessel itself aged quietly at dock while rain, salt air, and winter tides darkened its wooden hull further with each passing week. Outside the courthouse, harbor traffic continued normally through fog and cold Atlantic wind. Ships arrived carrying cargo and passengers from distant ports, while the silent brigantine remained fixed beside the pier as though waiting patiently for conclusions that never fully arrived. The sensory atmosphere within the investigation rooms carried a growing weariness difficult to separate from the physical surroundings themselves. Candles burned low during long evening sessions while the smell of old paper, wet wool, tobacco smoke, and seawater settled heavily into curtains, coats, and wooden furniture. Investigators leaned over documents until their eyes tired beneath flickering light reflected from brass instruments recovered aboard the brigantine. Clerks dipped pens repeatedly into ink bottles, while distant harbor bells drifted faintly through rain-streaked windows overlooking crowded waterfront streets. Sailors called to testify often answered the same questions many times in slightly different forms. Voices grew slower through repetition. Chairs scraped across floorboards. Pages turned softly beneath careful hands, searching once more for overlooked details buried somewhere within the scattered evidence surrounding the abandoned ship. Gradually, the inquiry shifted from hopeful investigation toward narrower legal concern focused upon salvage rights, financial motives, and the conduct of those who had first discovered the brigantine at sea. Certain officials remained deeply suspicious of Captain Morehouse and the crew of the Dei Grazia despite limited evidence supporting accusations of violence or conspiracy. Witnesses repeated descriptions of the untouched cargo, personal belongings left aboard, and the orderly condition of the cabins while investigators searched for contradictions within earlier testimony. Weather records were re-examined beside navigation calculations and damage reports from the vessel itself. Yet every path towards certainty narrowed into speculation once essential facts dissolved into the Atlantic beyond witness or recovery. The Mary Celeste resisted legal simplification because the physical evidence suggested both calm routine and sudden abandonment simultaneously, leaving investigators trapped between incompatible interpretations. For many people observing the prolonged inquiry, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the case likely became increasingly frustrating and melancholy rather than thrilling. Public fascination with maritime mystery often seeks dramatic revelation, yet real investigations frequently dissolve into paperwork, repeated testimony, and incomplete evidence, slowly losing clarity over time. The Mary Celeste seemed especially resistant to conclusion because human absence lay at the very center of every question. Officials could examine cargo manifests, weather conditions, and damaged logs, but they could not restore the missing voices once carried through the brigantine's cabins during ordinary days at sea. Somewhere beyond legal records and courtroom suspicion remained the quieter human reality of a family and crew separated forever from their moving wooden world. Outside the hearing rooms, Atlantic tides continued rising and falling against the harbor while winter clouds drifted slowly above the silent, abandoned ship. As the official inquiry slowly lost momentum, the physical records connected to the Mary Celeste began settling into storage rooms, filing cabinets, and maritime archives where uncertainty remained preserved within paper rather than resolved through conclusion. Damp witness statements, navigation charts, weather reports, and legal correspondence accumulated in uneven stacks tied together with string or pressed between thick ledger covers darkened by years of handling. Clerks carried boxes of documents through dim corridors lined with shelves crowded by older maritime cases already fading into obscurity. Outside the courthouse, the harbor moved steadily through changing weather and ordinary commerce, while the abandoned brigantine itself slowly disappeared from public attention. Yet the unresolved investigation lingered quietly within those rooms through unfinished paperwork and unanswered questions resting silently upon aging paper beneath dust and fading ink. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the later stages of the investigation carried the exhaustion of prolonged uncertainty rather than the sharp tension of earlier hearings. Offices smelled of drying paper, cold coal smoke, damp wool coats forgotten upon chairs, and stale air trapped inside rooms warmed unevenly through winter months. Lamps burned beside desks where officials reread testimony already familiar through repetition, while rain tapped softly against windows overlooking the gray harbor below. The scratch of pens across legal documents slowed as new evidence failed to emerge from the endless examination of weather records, cargo manifests, and damaged logs recovered from the brigantine. Sailors once questioned repeatedly about the drifting ship returned gradually to ordinary maritime work, carrying the mystery back into Atlantic routine while investigators remained surrounded by fragments of evidence incapable of forming complete explanation. During this quieter phase, the inquiry shifted toward smaller technical discussions increasingly disconnected from the emotional force that had first surrounded the abandoned vessel. Officials debated water measurements found within the hull, possible chemical reactions connected to industrial alcohol cargo, and navigational decisions Captain Briggs might have made under uncertain weather conditions at sea. Some investigators attempted to reconstruct the final days aboard the brigantine through charts and estimated positions across the Atlantic. Others quietly accepted that essential evidence would never surface because the ocean itself had erased too much from the final human moments aboard the ship. Without surviving witnesses, complete log entries, or physical proof of violence, every theory remained suspended between plausibility and speculation. The Mary Celeste gradually became a case defined less by discovery than by the persistent inability of official investigation to close its unanswered absence. For those who devoted long months to studying the brigantine and its vanished passengers, the emotional effect may have deepened precisely because certainty remained permanently beyond reach. Human institutions are built upon the belief that careful observation and rational inquiry can eventually draw truth out from confusion. The Mary Celeste challenged that belief quietly through silence rather than spectacle. The abandoned ship preserved ordinary signs of life while withholding the final emotional reality behind disappearance. Investigators could catalog objects, compare weather reports, and question sailors beneath courtroom lamps. Yet the Atlantic retained whatever fear, hesitation, or desperate decision had carried the crew away from the brigantine. Beyond the harbor and legal offices, cold gray tides continued moving beneath winter sky, while the unanswered mystery drifted gradually from official investigation into the deeper, darker waters of legend and memory. In the years following the investigation, the official records surrounding the Mary Celeste remained preserved within maritime archives, while the deeper mystery quietly resisted every form of conclusion. Dust gathered gradually across shelves holding weather reports, witness testimony, damaged navigation papers, and legal correspondence exchanged during the long inquiry. Clerks occasionally reopened certain files when journalists, writers, or curious officials returned seeking forgotten details hidden within the aging documents. Yet the physical evidence never changed. The same damp charts rested folded beside incomplete log entries. The same descriptions of untouched belongings and the missing lifeboat appeared repeatedly across faded pages written beneath courthouse lamps many winters earlier. Beyond those stored records, the Atlantic itself continued moving through tides, storms, and shipping routes, entirely indifferent to every human attempt to force certainty upon the abandoned brigantine and its vanished passengers. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the surviving investigation materials carried the quiet decay of time passing through paper, ink, and memory. Old files breathed faintly of dust, candle smoke, seawater absorbed long ago into damp pages, and leather bindings worn smooth through repeated handling. When researchers opened those documents years later, loose sheets rustled softly beneath careful fingers while faded handwriting emerged slowly from yellowing paper. Outside archive windows, harbor life continued with familiar sounds drifting through distant streets, ship bells echoing through fog, rain tapping against stone buildings near the waterfront, coal smoke moving across the winter air above crowded docks. The world surrounding the investigation changed gradually through passing decades, yet the unanswered silence preserved within those documents remained strangely intact, carried forward through generations who continued searching for final explanation. Over time, the official inquiry itself became part of the broader mystery surrounding the Mary Celeste rather than its resolution. Historians, journalists, and maritime enthusiasts revisited the surviving records repeatedly, comparing forgotten testimony against newer theories shaped by evolving understanding of weather, navigation, and shipboard life. Some later researchers argued that Captain Briggs had likely abandoned the brigantine temporarily after fearing explosion from alcohol fumes rising below deck. Others believed navigational error, damaged equipment, or rough Atlantic conditions had permanently separated the missing lifeboat from the drifting vessel. Yet every explanation depended partly upon imagination filling gaps left empty by vanished witnesses and incomplete evidence. The investigation had gathered countless details surrounding the brigantine, but the crucial human moment itself remained hidden beyond recovery somewhere upon the cold winter Atlantic. For those who reflected upon the Mary Celeste long after courts closed their hearings and newspapers abandoned daily speculation, the mystery endured because it revealed something fundamental about the limits of human understanding. The brigantine offered physical evidence without emotional certainty. It preserved objects, routines, and fragments of ordinary life while withholding the invisible thoughts and decisions that had shaped its final hours at sea. Investigators attempted to organize the unknown through law, testimony, and reason, yet the Atlantic had already carried away too much before the drifting ship was ever discovered. In the end, perhaps the endless investigation became part of the meaning itself. Human beings continued searching because the unanswered absence aboard the Mary Celeste felt deeply and irreducibly personal beneath all maritime legend and legal procedure. And yet, even as courts fell silent and files gathered dust, one question refused to rest. One possibility remained that no investigator had yet dared to examine fully. What if the answer had been there all along, hiding not in the ship's records, but in the final desperate words written by the one person aboard the Mary Celeste who may have sensed the end approaching? As the courtroom ledgers closed and the centuries aged, the physical timbers of the ship broke apart. Yet, the true voyage of the Mary Celeste was only just beginning, sailing away from the hard ground of history into the eternal fog of cultural myth. Long after the original brigantine vanished from active maritime life, the image of the Mary Celeste continued drifting quietly through human memory like a ship crossing endless fog somewhere beyond sight of land. Decades passed across the Atlantic world as steamships displaced older sailing vessels and crowded harbors transformed beneath new industries, electric lights, and modern machinery. Yet the abandoned brigantine survived within imagination more clearly than many larger or more celebrated ships from the same era. Illustrations in books showed pale sails rising through mist above empty decks and dark Atlantic water. Libraries stored aging newspaper clippings beside maritime histories, while later documentaries recreated the silent cabins, the untouched meal, and the drifting vessel discovered beneath gray winter sky. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the legend shifted gradually with each new generation that encountered the story. In earlier years, sailors heard the mystery repeated beside smoky harbor fires and rain-covered tavern windows near Atlantic docks. Later, readers discovered the brigantine through quiet libraries smelling of old paper, dust, and polished wooden shelves lined with maritime histories. Radio voices eventually described the drifting vessel late at night, while listeners sat beside softly glowing lamps during storms moving outside their homes. Much later still, documentaries filled darkened rooms with the sound of creaking timber, rolling waves, and distant gulls circling above cold gray water. The Mary Celeste continued traveling through human senses even after the real brigantine disappeared from practical existence, carried forward through imagination, retelling, and the enduring emotional atmosphere of the abandoned ship. As years turned into decades, the mystery surrounding the Mary Celeste slowly shifted further away from historical investigation and closer toward symbolic presence within cultural memory. Writers returned repeatedly to the same details that had unsettled earlier generations: the folded belongings, the unfinished meal, the child's possessions left quietly inside the cabin. New interpretations appeared constantly through novels, magazine articles, films, and speculative essays imagining what might have happened aboard the brigantine before its abandonment at sea. Some stories emphasized supernatural fear, while others focused upon loneliness, weather, or the psychological strain of Atlantic isolation. Yet despite these changing interpretations, the emotional center remained remarkably consistent. An empty ship drifting silently through cold water beneath pale sky continued capturing human attention because absence itself carried strange and lasting imaginative power. For many people encountering the Mary Celeste long after the 19th century had faded into history, the brigantine became less a real merchant vessel and more a floating emotional landscape shaped by quiet uncertainty. The Atlantic represented distance and mystery in ways modern life rarely allows people to experience directly. A drifting ship abandoned without explanation invited reflection about disappearance, memory, and the fragile routines humans build within uncertain worlds. Bedtime stories, documentaries, and late-night reading transformed the brigantine into something almost dreamlike, moving slowly through imagination beneath endless gray clouds. Somewhere within that collective memory, lantern light still trembles softly across empty cabins, while cold Atlantic waves rise and fall against the hull of a ship that never fully returned from the silence surrounding its vanished crew. As the 20th century unfolded, the story of the Mary Celeste continued appearing in new forms shaped by changing technology and different ways people consumed history. Hardcover books with faded maritime paintings rested inside quiet studies where readers turned pages slowly beside rain-streaked windows and evening lamps. Magazine articles revisited the abandoned brigantine during cold winter months when Atlantic storms moved across newspapers and radio broadcasts. Later, black and white films recreated the drifting ship within studio-built oceans filled with artificial fog, creaking wood, and lantern light reflecting across dark water. Though the real brigantine had vanished long before, its imagined image grew sharper through repetition. The pale sails, the silent deck, the untouched belongings waiting inside the empty cabin. Each retelling carried the Mary Celeste farther from ordinary maritime history and deeper into cultural memory. The sensory atmosphere surrounding these retellings evolved gently through passing decades while preserving the emotional texture of the original mystery. Radio narrators spoke softly about the abandoned vessel, while listeners sat beneath blankets during stormy evenings hearing distant wind move outside their homes. Libraries carried the smell of dust, aging paper, and polished shelves where maritime histories waited quietly beneath dim overhead light. Later, documentary programs filled darkened living rooms with the sound of Atlantic waves, groaning timber, and gulls circling above reconstructed scenes of the drifting brigantine. Even modern digital recordings attempted recreating the atmosphere of cold gray sea and empty cabins through slow narration and soft ocean sound. The Mary Celeste survived not through physical preservation, but through carefully repeated sensory experience carried across generations of listeners, readers, and viewers seeking quiet mystery before sleep or reflection. As interest in the brigantine continued across modern decades, researchers and storytellers approached the mystery from increasingly different directions. Historians revisited official records and weather reports, hoping that improved maritime knowledge might finally explain the abandonment through rational evidence. Fiction writers explored emotional possibilities hidden within the missing final hours aboard the ship. Documentary creators reconstructed cabins, charts, and Atlantic conditions while speaking cautiously about theories involving alcohol fumes, navigational fear, or temporary evacuation gone tragically wrong. At the same time, supernatural interpretations never disappeared entirely. Ghost ship legends, paranormal speculation, and imagined curses continued surrounding the brigantine because the unanswered silence at the center of the story encouraged endless reinterpretation. The Mary Celeste adapted naturally to every generation's fears, fascinations, and emotional relationship with the unknowable sea. For people hearing the story late at night through documentaries, books, or quiet conversation, the emotional effect often emerged less from fear than from a reflective loneliness carried gently through the image of the drifting ship. The abandoned brigantine suggested a world where human presence could fade suddenly while ordinary objects remained waiting quietly behind. Cups left upon tables, blankets folded near empty bunks, damp charts spread beneath lantern light beside windows facing endless Atlantic fog. Such details invited listeners to imagine absence in intimate rather than violent ways. Over time, the Mary Celeste became something closer to shared bedtime imagination, moving softly through collective memory. Long after the real Atlantic voyage ended, the ghostly image of the brigantine continued drifting beneath pale sky through stories whispered calmly across generations, carrying unanswered silence farther into history and dream. As interest in the Mary Celeste continued through later decades, the abandoned brigantine slowly entered classrooms, museums, late-night radio programs, and quiet documentary narration spoken over images of rolling Atlantic water. Maritime paintings showed the vessel drifting beneath pale fog, while museum displays arranged old navigation tools, weather charts, and model ships beneath glass cases lit softly against dark walls. Writers visited archives searching through faded witness statements and legal testimony preserved from the original investigation. Some traveled to Atlantic coastlines hoping the physical presence of the ocean might help them understand the emotional atmosphere surrounding the mystery. Yet the real brigantine remained distant from all these later efforts, scattered across memory and speculation rather than preserved physically within any harbor or museum collection. The sensory world surrounding the legend became increasingly calm and reflective as modern audiences encountered the story through slower, more deliberate forms of storytelling. Documentary narrators spoke quietly over footage of gray waves moving beneath winter cloud, while soft music blended with distant gull cries and the sound of creaking timber recreated inside recording studios. Readers discovered the mystery during silent evenings beside bedside lamps where pages smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old library shelves. In classrooms, teachers lowered their voices while describing the untouched belongings found aboard the drifting vessel. The story encouraged imagination through atmosphere rather than violence. People pictured lantern light swaying inside empty cabins, damp charts curling beside abandoned cups, and Atlantic mist moving endlessly around a silent brigantine, carrying no visible crew across cold, open water beneath pale sky. As new generations revisited the Mary Celeste, interpretations continued changing in small but revealing ways. Earlier retellings often emphasized sensational theories involving mutiny, piracy, or supernatural terror at sea. Later researchers approached the mystery more quietly, focusing instead upon weather patterns, maritime psychology, and the practical fears experienced by sailors crossing the Atlantic during the 19th century. Some believe Captain Briggs may have ordered temporary evacuation after misreading dangerous conditions aboard the ship. Others explored how isolation, exhaustion, or uncertainty might influence decision-making during long voyages far from land. Yet despite these calmer interpretations, the emotional image of the drifting brigantine remained largely unchanged. The abandoned vessel still floated through collective imagination, carrying ordinary domestic traces preserved within extraordinary and inexplicable absence. For many people encountering the story during quiet nighttime reading or reflective documentary viewing, the Mary Celeste came to symbolize something larger than one unsolved maritime event. The brigantine suggested how memory itself drifts slowly across generations, gathering new meaning while losing certain details beneath time and retelling. Oceans continued moving through storms, tides, and shipping routes long after the original voyage ended. Yet the image of the empty ship remained suspended within cultural imagination. Human beings return repeatedly to stories that resist final explanation because unanswered spaces invite contemplation rather than conclusion. Somewhere within those calm retellings, the Mary Celeste continues traveling softly through bedtime imagination. Lanterns glowing faintly within abandoned cabins, while Atlantic waves rise beneath pale fog, and the vanished crew remains forever just beyond reach of certainty or return. By the later 20th century, the Mary Celeste had become part of a wider landscape of quiet historical mystery carried through bookstores, television programs, and conversations shared during calm evening hours. Images of the brigantine appeared on documentary covers beside painted Atlantic fog and pale moonlight reflecting across empty decks. Maritime museums displayed small ship models beneath glass, while visitors moved slowly past written descriptions of the abandoned vessel and its vanished crew. Historians continued searching through preserved court records and witness testimony stored within aging archives. Yet outside those careful investigations, the ghostly reputation of the brigantine grew steadily stronger through fiction, illustration, and repeated storytelling. The real ship faded gradually into distance, while the symbolic image of an empty vessel drifting alone across gray Atlantic waters settled deeply into modern imagination. The sensory atmosphere surrounding these later retellings felt softer and more reflective than the crowded harbor rumors of earlier generations. Documentary soundtracks layered quiet piano music beneath the low rhythm of waves striking wooden hulls recreated for modern audiences. Television screens glowed faintly inside dark living rooms, where viewers watched slow camera movements across empty cabins filled with lantern light and scattered belongings. Libraries carried the scent of aging books and polished wood while readers sat quietly turning pages describing damp charts, abandoned cups, and cold Atlantic mist surrounding the brigantine at sea. Even bedtime conversations between parents and children sometimes drifted gently toward the image of the silent ship floating somewhere beyond sight of land. The Mary Celeste endured because its atmosphere invited calm imagination rather than sudden fear or violent spectacle. As historical understanding evolved, writers and researchers gradually moved away from dramatic supernatural explanations and toward quieter human possibilities shaped by weather, uncertainty, and emotional pressure aboard long-sea voyages. Scholars examined 19th century maritime practices, the behavior of alcohol fumes below deck, and the psychological strain created by Atlantic isolation during dangerous crossings far from rescue or communication. New theories emerged carefully from weather data and navigation records rather than sensational newspaper rumors. Yet no explanation ever settled completely into accepted truth. Each interpretation illuminated certain details while leaving other questions untouched. The brigantine remained emotionally unresolved because its physical evidence preserved ordinary domestic life too clearly beside unexplained absence. The folded blankets, the unfinished meal, and the scattered belongings continued resisting final closure no matter how rational later analysis became. For modern audiences, the lasting emotional power of the Mary Celeste often comes from how gently the story invites reflection about memory, disappearance, and the passage of time itself. The brigantine no longer feels connected only to one Atlantic voyage during the 19th century. Instead, it drifts through imagination as a floating symbol of unanswered human absence preserved quietly within ordinary surroundings. People picture lanterns swaying softly above empty tables while cold gray waves move beyond cabin windows hidden within fog. The mystery asks no urgent question and offers no final revelation. It lingers calmly at the edge of thought, like distant ocean sound heard late at night. Somewhere within collective memory, the Mary Celeste continues crossing endless water beneath pale winter sky, carrying silence gently through history, storytelling, and dream. As the decades continued passing, the Mary Celeste settled more deeply into the quiet corners of cultural memory where certain stories survive not because they are solved, but because they continue creating atmosphere within the imagination. The brigantine appeared in illustrated books beside paintings of pale Atlantic horizons and drifting fog that softened the boundary between history and dream. Small model ships rested inside museum cases while visitors paused briefly before reading descriptions of the abandoned vessel and the vanished family once carried aboard its wooden decks. Long after the real brigantine disappeared from practical maritime life, its image remained strangely intact. Empty cabins lit by lantern glow, damp charts resting upon a captain's desk, gray waves moving endlessly beneath cold winter sky, around a ship traveling without visible destination or return. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the legend became increasingly gentle through modern retellings, shaped for quiet listening and reflective viewing. Slow documentary narration blended with distant ocean sounds, creaking timber, and soft music designed to recreate the emotional solitude of the drifting vessel. Readers encountered the story late at night beneath bedside lamps, while rain moved softly against windows outside their homes. Libraries and bookstores carried the scent of paper, dust, and polished shelves where maritime mysteries rested quietly among histories of vanished worlds and forgotten voyages. Even internet recordings and modern audio stories preserve the same calm, emotional texture that had surrounded the brigantine since its discovery at sea. The Mary Celeste survived across changing technologies because the deeper atmosphere of absence, silence, and drifting uncertainty translated naturally into every new form of storytelling. As modern audiences revisited the mystery repeatedly, the story gradually separated further from factual investigation and moved closer toward symbolic reflection about human fragility within vast natural spaces. Historians still examined weather records and legal testimony, yet many listeners became less interested in final explanation than in the emotional image created by the abandoned ship itself. Writers explored themes of isolation, memory, and unfinished routine through fictional interpretations inspired by the brigantine. Filmmakers lingered visually upon untouched cups, folded blankets, and lantern light trembling across empty cabins surrounded by Atlantic darkness. Each generation discovered slightly different meaning within the same drifting vessel. Some saw fear, others imagined loneliness, quiet tragedy, or the strange beauty of unresolved mystery carried gently across time like fog moving over cold water before dawn. For many people, the Mary Celeste eventually became part of bedtime imagination itself. The brigantine entered that quiet mental space where historical reality softens into reflective dream and distant atmosphere. Listeners closed their eyes while hearing descriptions of waves rolling beneath wooden hulls and mist gathering slowly around pale sails somewhere beyond the horizon. The abandoned ship invited contemplation rather than shock because its silence felt calm even while remaining deeply unsettling. Human absence lingered softly inside ordinary domestic surroundings preserved within the drifting vessel. A cup waiting beside the table, a child's belongings resting near the bunk, a lantern hanging motionless above empty passageways. Through decades of retelling, the Mary Celeste continued sailing slowly through collective memory beneath gray Atlantic cloud, carrying unanswered quietness farther into history and imagination. In the end, the Mary Celeste drifted far beyond the boundaries of its original voyage and entered a quieter place within human memory where certain mysteries continue existing without urgent need for resolution. The brigantine belonged once to practical maritime life shaped by cargo, weather, navigation, and ordinary Atlantic routine. Yet over time, those physical realities softened beneath layers of storytelling, reflection, and imagination carried across generations. The abandoned ship became less connected to official records or courtroom testimony and more associated with pale fog, silent cabins, and lantern light trembling softly against damp wooden walls. Though the real vessel eventually vanished from the world, its emotional image endured with unusual clarity. A ship without voices, a table left waiting, gray sea stretching endlessly beneath cold winter sky. The sensory atmosphere surrounding the Mary Celeste now lives mostly within quiet forms of remembrance rather than physical history. Readers encounter the brigantine through the soft rustle of pages turned late at night beneath dim bedside lamps. Documentary audiences hear recreated Atlantic waves rolling beneath slow narration and distant gull cries carried through carefully layered sound. In museums and libraries, the smell of old paper, polished wood, and aging maritime records surrounds displays connected to the drifting vessel. Even modern digital recordings attempt preserving the calm loneliness woven deeply into the story since the 19th century. Across changing centuries and technologies, the emotional texture remains remarkably familiar. Empty passageways, damp charts curling near silent windows, the low creak of timber moving gently across dark Atlantic water beneath drifting mist and pale moonlight. As historians and storytellers continued revisiting the mystery, the unanswered questions themselves became part of the enduring emotional structure surrounding the brigantine. Practical explanations involving weather, navigation, or fear may indeed rest closest to historical truth, yet complete certainty never fully arrived. The Atlantic preserved fragments while carrying other details permanently beyond recovery. Because of that irreversible absence, each generation reshaped the Mary Celeste according to its own emotional concerns and imagination. Some focused upon maritime danger and isolation. Others reflected upon memory, disappearance, or the fragile routines people build against uncertainty. The drifting ship adapted naturally to these changing interpretations because its silence left space for contemplation rather than final instruction. The brigantine remained suspended between documented reality and symbolic dream, moving quietly through history without settling entirely into either one. Perhaps that is why the Mary Celeste still lingers so gently within human imagination after all these years. The story does not demand fear or dramatic excitement. Instead, it invites quieter reflection about distance, absence, and the mysterious spaces that remain beyond explanation even after the most careful investigation. Somewhere in collective memory, the brigantine continues crossing calm Atlantic water beneath pale gray cloud while lantern light glows faintly inside abandoned cabins. The waves move softly against the hull. Mist gathers slowly around the empty deck. Beyond the rail stretches endless ocean, carrying silence farther toward the horizon. The vanished crew never fully returns. The unanswered questions never fully disappear. And the ghost ship sails onward through books, documentaries, bedtime stories, and drifting imagination, long after history itself has faded into nothing but the sound of the sea.